Hi, it's Fraser here, and before we get into this week's episode where we dig down into last week's seismic general election, I'd like to thank everyone who has supported Spike this year. You might have bought something from our online shop, you might have given us a one-off or monthly donation, or you might have recommended Spike to friends and shared our articles online. All of you have played a part in helping Spike to reach new heights and get our pro-democracy, pro-freedom message out there to new people. So thank you from me and the team. Of course, Spiked is not done yet. We'll also need your help to take the fight into 2020. Donations are the best way to support us directly. One-off donations are brilliant, and regular donations are even better. Why not become a regular Spiked supporter this Christmas by clicking on the big red donate button on the top right of the homepage? Anything you can give would be hugely appreciated and could make all the difference in the year ahead. So thanks in advance for any help. And now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week we have Spike's deputy editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up, we'll be discussing the latest fallout from the general election.
I think it was Brexit that did this. We were in this horns of a dilemma. We couldn't move either way.
What is the point of the Labour Party if we don't respect and represent those voices?
My government's priority is to deliver the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union.
A new golden age for this United Kingdom is now.
So the dust is starting to settle on perhaps the most significant general election in a generation. The huge victory for Boris Johnson means that Brexit will now happen on his terms and to his timetable. The parliamentary deadlock that defines so much of this year has been cleared, and so many of the Brexit blockers have been brutally swept aside. Tom, let's start with what your main takeaway is from the past week.
Well, I know it's not a unique point at this point, but I guess it was just the scale of the defeat for Labour amongst what should be their traditional base, working class people in particular. We talked a little bit last week about the particular seats that swung to the Tories and how many of them, historically had been dyed-in-the-wool Labour seats and how symbolic that was. But what's been interesting is as the analysis has started to come out, as the various surveys have begun to be published, you really start to see the kind of scale of the potential realignment of British politics that we're seeing. So in YouGov survey, they found that the Tories were leading amongst C2 DE over Labour. So in C2, Tories took 49% of the vote, Labour 31%. In DE, the Tories took 47%, Labour took 34%. And what's interesting is even though there's been a lot of quibbling about the categories for social class, the NRS social grades in particular, as Paula Surridge, a pollster, pointed out, that also if you dig into the YouGov numbers, you saw that the Tories won in households earning under £20,000. This is something which doesn't matter what way you try to splice it, as many people have been trying to splice it various different ways in the wake of this vote. This is a really historic defeat, and it's quite clear that where the Tories' dynamism were in this race were from those working class voters and those working class constituencies deciding to take a chance on them. Some of the biggest swings of the night were in places that have been Labour for time immemorial. Basset Law was one of them. It's been Labour since 1935, basically ever since Labour has been a proper national political force. It had an 18% swing to the Tories. Saw similar things in Great Grimsby, around a 15% swing, and that was under the Sunday Times analysis. And then again, you look at the one place where they gained, and it's Putney.
Yeah.
So the importance of this, I think, can't be brushed over, but it has been really striking that whilst there has been some begrudging acceptance of this fact that Labour can no longer really claim to be the party of the working class, there is still this attempt at denialism. There is still this attempt to suggest that because of their support from young voters, they're still representing the deprived people of Britain. That simple fact cannot be ignored, and it calls into question not just Labour's ability to get close to power again, but the point of why they're supposed to be in politics in the first place, which is to represent those kinds of people. That just seems so shot at this point.
I'm going to add one more piece of analysis that proves this, which is the Financial Times analysis, which showed that these seats that we've been talking about, the red wall seats, as much as Corbynomics might try and claim that this is the old working class, actually these are the seats with the highest proportion of skilled and unskilled manual workers in the country. So there's simply no way of evading this. And, as you alluded to, they try and say that the real battleground is generations. Young people are asset poor, older people asset rich. They often point to education being a factor. People with basically lower educational qualifications are more likely to vote Tory, and they say, well, actually, that's an indicator of age and not class. I mean, there's some truth in that, but class obviously plays a role. It seems very odd for, left-wing people in particular to not notice there is a kind of structural gap in between working class people and middle class people in terms of the level of education there. But, at every turn, it seems to be denial that this is an issue for them.
And it's remarkable because it's so obvious. I mean, I don't think any of us in this room predicted the landslide that the Tories eventually gained. But I certainly didn't think Labour was going to do well out of it, simply because for the last year or so, and longer, they've been talking about the working class and describing them as poor, disaffected, on the breadline, or, pathetic, kind of in these really patronising terms. But they've never actually spoken to, and they certainly don't speak for these people, simply because they've rejected Brexit. And it was quite funny watching the interviews just after the exit poll had come out. John McDonnell was interviewed with his kind of a hangdog expression. And he said, well, I think we've all come to terms with the fact that this is about Brexit. And you think, no shit, Sherlock. I mean, where have you been for the last 3.5 years? It's obvious that the one thing vast numbers of working class voters in this country wanted, which was Brexit, was denied by the Labour Party. And so obviously they're not going to turn to you. I mean, the difficult thing about this is that there have been some conflicting analyses on what the reason was for the turn against Labour. Interestingly, like the Ashcroft polls, one of the questions asked was, what was your main driving force for voting in this? And the first one was whether or not you trusted the motives of the leaders. The second one was who was going to do a better job of the economy. And the third one was Brexit. Now, obviously, with Conservative voters, Brexit was much more of a priority. But there was also things at play, like the fact that not only was Corbyn not deemed trustworthy or slightly suspect because of the anti-Semitism issue, but also because of this sitting on the fence with the Brexit deal, also because of the fact that Johnson had a very clear message. All these things were at play, but the scrabbling around for who to blame among some Labour supporters, whether it's the media or, biased reporting or dog whistle tactics or any of this nonsense, it's just avoiding the B word.
I thought it was really interesting as well how identity politics, I guess, factored into the class denialism, as you saw it with the reaction from certain Corbynistas in particular to the results. There was one quite prominent Corbynista who shall remain nameless, who suggested that we can talk about this result, but can we not play into the dog whistle heartlands narrative, which, as we all know, is deeply racialised. And there is been this sort of tendency over recent months and years for the Corbynistas, particularly in the wake of the 2017 result, because it's easy to forget that was the first election in living memory at which class ceased to be a kind of indicator as to how you would vote, and it's important to remember that this is a kind of slower progression that nevertheless really kind of started to crest in 2017. But there's been this tendency to suggest, look, of course, ethnic minority people in cities, they're working class too. And of course, no one disputes that whatsoever. But it seems like they almost feel that if they can focus on one section of the working class that does still support them, then that means you can completely discount all the others who have obviously moved away from you entirely. This tendency to try and talk about young media professionals as part of the working class, and also often highly represented amongst Corbynista media outriders. It's just so obvious at this point that this is at best a tactic, but also on the other hand a kind of indicator as to why they lost these people in the first place, because not only are they just kind of making up excuses, but they for a long time, because of the influence of identity politics and that kind of grievance politics over their thinking, and because of all of the narratives that involves, the idea that there are all these kind of thick racist people out there and all the rest of it, it has made them just almost not care about class politics. Really, they pretend that they do, but really they don't.
And of course, the other faction who are trying to take advantage of this are the Blairites, and they have their ready-made explanation of why Corbyn failed, and it's because, he's not centrist enough. What do you make of that kind of narrative?
Well, it doesn't really hold that much weight because there hasn't been a huge amount of difference between the manifesto this time round and the one in 2017. They've kind of stepped it up slightly with the messaging and the, slightly more comprehensive announcements about what they were going to nationalise and throwing money here or there. But in general, everyone knows what Corbyn's about. Everyone knows what McDonnell's about. Everyone knows about Corbynomics pretty well by now. And so the idea that is what turned off voters, and that you need to be sort of more fiscally responsible or less momentum-y. I mean, these forces have been within the Labour Party for a long time now. The difference was in 2017, they did not have the Brexit policy they had this time around. And I mean, the thing that I think was something to watch during the election campaign was this characterization both of Corbyn and his team as, insurgent Marxists who are going to revolutionize the British economy, which wasn't true, but also the kind of fear-mongering around any kind of sense of economic change, the terror that people have of a hard left and a hard right. Got all these kind of young Tory commentators going on in the most kind of alarmist language about the prospect of a socialist Britain. And I really think that most voters were more sensible than that and saw through that and, let the commentators who are trying to attention seek about these things get on with it. And actually they had more serious reasons for rejecting Labour rather than buying into the whole nonsense of the, Reds under the bed scare that was essentially around Labour Party.
I think that's really true. But what's interesting is that, of course, in an election, you're going to get dirt thrown at you and you're going to throw dirt back. Yeah. So it's obvious that the Tories would try and characterise Corbyn and Corbynomics in this way. But I think what was most telling was the way so many Corbyn outriders embraced this position that we're radicals, we're Marxists. Ash Sarkar famously saying, I'm literally a communist when, we all know that actually she wants to remain in the EU and is quite happy with, the way the economy is run at the moment and on those terms. So they played a role in encouraging that and they shouldn't now turn and blame the media if they feel that, this was off-putting to voters.
No, completely. And I think it's important as well because there's kind of two competing explanations, isn't there? One of which is that it's all about Corbyn, which can allow the more more passionately pro-Remain sections of the Labour Party to claim it had nothing to do whatsoever with the Brexit position. And then, of course, you've now got these Corbynistas who've come round to the idea that actually, trying to overturn a democratic vote, which is the biggest mandate in our history, is actually now a bad idea, and they finally realise that. So there's these two competing things, but obviously they're wrapped up together. There was some research from Opinium who found that amongst people who defected from Labour to the Tories, who I think are the ones we're sort of most interested in and all seem to be quite decisive at this election, 45% of them, it was the leadership that made them make that decision. 31% was the policy on Brexit. And those two things are largely intertwined, I think, on one level. Interestingly, only about 6% said it was the economic policy. So again, it does lend some credence to that point, which it isn't necessarily about the substance of them. It's more about the leadership and the broader author. And I think what that does say is that those two things were bound up together because Jeremy Corbyn, not only because of his unseemly associations and, his approach to anti-Semitism, which I think did cut through in a way that it really hadn't beforehand, which I think was a positive thing insofar as that was a really crucial issue. The two things are very much bound up because he did stand at 2017 saying he would implement this result and he didn't. And he, was slowly captured by the more Remainer forces in his party. He gave in to them. And of course, that seemed to have some bearing on the result.
Just quickly on the, on the economic stuff, I think also voters will have noticed what the Tories were offering. This was a 2-horse race and the Conservatives offered a pretty much deficit-busting package of public spending. And, I think people realised that there maybe wasn't a huge difference in the amount that Boris Johnson was promising to spend on the NHS and Labour was promising to spend on the NHS, even though Labour told us that, the NHS was going to be over if they lost. So
I'm amazed we haven't sold it to Trump yet. When is that going to happen?
might be happening as we record this. So, going forward, the Labour leadership seems to be kind of kicking off in earnest. Emily Thornberry has officially thrown her hat in the ring.
God.
The right reaction. So Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, Lisa Nandy have all said they're considering it. I mean, this doesn't look good for them, does it? There aren't many great contenders for this.
Yeah, Yvette Cooper, who has had a go and previously lost a leadership election already, so she'll at least know how it goes. I mean, the interesting thing about this leadership election, there's two things. First of all, is that it's almost a given that it has to be a woman. And even very anti-Labour commentators have been sort of coming out and saying, the Tories have now had 2 female prime ministers, Labour Party has to step it up. And if they were to learn anything from the last election, and actually I think Brendan O'Neill has made this point elsewhere, it's that voters in, as we've been talking about, working class areas have just elected a big eaten bombastic oaf who looks and sounds nothing like them. And so the idea that identity or representing a certain group in society matters has thankfully been proved wrong in this election. And, even the fact that as it happens, the Ashcroft poll shows that women weren't particularly swayed towards Labour, even though Labour has a much more identity politics, pro-women, 50-50 representation, whole sections in his manifestos based on things aimed specifically at women. That didn't work. So, why does it have to be a woman? It does not have to be a woman. Presumably it has to be. If they're going to learn anything, it has to be someone who's pro-Brexit. And the second thing is what's interesting around we've talked a bit about the Blairite side, and then there's the kind of the momentum Corbyn side, who simply believe that they just need to get a reincarnation of Corbyn in there, whether that be Rebecca Long-Bailey or, someone like Lisa Nandy, who's sympathetic, has a bit of an accent, is going to be able to chime in with those people they've lost in the North. The thing they're obsessed with at the moment is messaging and comms. And it's like this it's the extremes of the workings of a party machine where they think all they need to do, they've got the right politics, they've got the right message, but all they need to do is just somehow hoodwink voters into getting that. And that will be in the form of this new, very message prepped new leader. That, again, is nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, the part of the denialism that we were alluding to earlier is in that, we were right. We won the argument, as Jeremy Corbyn said. But Tom?
All of the people who are lining themselves up at the moment, so as you say, at the time of recording, Emily Thornberry is the only one who's actually properly declared, but you've also got, Sir Keir Starmer, you have Rebecca Long-Bailey, as we talked about, Angela Rayner. There's talk of those two kind of standing on a ticket, so where Angela Rayner would be her deputy. And there's obviously a lot of discussion at the moment about who members might go for, given the fact that members are seen as very friendly to Corbyn. I've always tended to think that, or at least my hunch was that whilst Labour members do want something that looks quite radical, and they are kind of ideological in that sense, you could easily see a situation in which someone like a Keir Starmer could, as he has been doing in his pitch so far, such as it is, try to say this isn't about a lurch to the right, it's about just kind of repackaging the politics as it currently is. So I always thought that they wouldn't necessarily end up with another kind of ideologue, if we want to call it that. But what's just so striking about all of them is that none of them really set the pulse racing apart from in the wrong way, like Emily Thornberry. They're just, there's something about this leadership discussion as it is currently, which is either, carry on as usual in relation to Corbynism, or revert back to some version of more centrist Brownite or Blairite politics, which just seems so utterly delusional. It doesn't seem to have got to grips with the scale of the defeat. It doesn't seem to have got to grips with the fact that even though many of them are proceeding on the basis, well, Brexit is kind of a done issue now. Even Tony Blair has kind of admitted defeat this week on the question of we are leaving the European Union. There's this kind of assumption that, now that's out of the way, we can just kind of sneak back in there because, these people are Labour, really. And I think that's really misjudges the electorate in the sense that, first of all, people don't forget a betrayal that quickly. This party has become the primary means through which Brexit was slowed down, almost overturned via a second referendum. People aren't going to forget that. But also just the broader, more historic shift that all of this represents. And just coming back to the Blairites for 1 second, I thought it was interesting that there's this kind of attempt to kind of just blame all of this on Corbyn. But in relation to the working classes in particular, their base moving away from them, this has been happening from before Tony Blair, but certainly under Tony Blair in particular. Bishop Auckland is an interesting example. In 1997, its majority was 21,000, and it slowly went down the years that Blair was in power to the point where at 2017 it was just 500, And this is a point that John Curtis has made, is the fact that in many respects Corbynism finished what Blairism started in terms of moving the party towards the middle class. This is a political break with these people. It is this move towards a paternalism that both sides of the party share, but it's also a kind of deeper kind of cultural break as well. These people just don't feel like they represent them anymore. And I think, again, just moving in someone who is a more, PR friendly version of what they've had before, or moving back to the older politics, just doesn't seem to be them reckoning with the depth and the scale of this defeat at this point.
I think what seems to have happened is that, they've become, over the years, obviously reliant on what we're now calling the red wall towns, those old Labour safe seats. And because those seats were safe, those voters could kind of be neglected. And then they could kind of fashion their appeal better and better towards the kind of middle class voters who maybe wouldn't have backed them in the 1980s, but that they won over under the Blair coalition. But they seem to now have completely lost touch and have no idea how to go back to the old voters. They've really lost that footing in a sense.
They're also just sort of blinded to the fact that they have been insulting people for a very long time. And Clive Lewis tweeted this ridiculous, this Turkish proverb that's being retweeted. I don't know if anyone's seen it, about the axe, and, you know, the Woods kept voting for the axe, essentially saying people were tricked into voting for the Tories because the Tories said they were on their side, and actually the working class couldn't see that really the Tories are just out to destroy them. And it's that kind of, it's that paternalism and that patronising attitude of, we know what's good for you that you don't even know yourself. So sure, you voted for Brexit, but we know that it's going to be bad for you and you lose your job. You know, sure, you have problems with immigration, but we know that actually what you're really doing is expressing a kind of innate racism. And all that talking down to people isn't just going to be reversed with, oh, Brexit's over and done with, and so now you come back into the fold. That is the damage, as Tom said, that's been chipping away. We kind of forget about the impact of the Labour Party's external to Brexit extreme focus on identity politics, whether it be to do with trans rights or women or racism. All of that has been pissing people off for years, and they've paid for it now in this election.
Caroline Flint made an interesting allegation. Tom, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that in relation to talking down to the voters.
Yeah,
careful, you might get sued.
I'll have to do this very carefully. So on Sunday, I think it was, on Sophie Ridge's show on Sky News, Caroline Flint, obviously the former MP for Don Valley, who lost their seat in the midst of that wipeout, was someone who was very much took the kind of Brexit vote seriously and wanted to see it implemented. She basically just torpedoed Emily Thornberry's campaign before it even got off the ground by making this allegation that another Labour Leave MP had said to her that Emily Thornberry had said to this MP that at least my voters, her voters in Islington, aren't as stupid as yours. Emily Thornberry, we should say, vehemently denies that this is the case. She accuses Caroline Flint of, quote, making shit up about her, and is taking it to the court. But the good thing about Emily Thornberry is you don't have to go far for more examples of her talking down to the electorate. Of course, we all remember the tweet from Rochester and Stroud of the white van with the crosses of St George hanging over it, as well as, you know, clips of her cackling when Dawn Butler MP is talking about how, I don't care who you are, if you don't hate Brexit, even if you voted for it, there must be something wrong with you, and her erupting into laughter. But it was an interesting little moment, I think, because it did demonstrate, because it does feel like Thornberry's campaign is a non-starter now. I mean, we'll see what happens. But it just, the kind of level of entitlement these kind of middle-class, do-goodery Labour-type people feel over the Labour Party and the Labour vote, the fact that they feel it's their party, the fact that they feel it's their right to have these voters, etc., even if they insult them all the time, I think Thornberry really represents that. And her failures so far, and the fact that it feels like at least her campaign isn't going to get off the ground, represents the fact that that era is over on some level.
Let's talk a bit about the Tories now. If the Labour allegations are to be believed, we have now been taken over by a far-right government that is racist, going to sell off the NHS, going to destroy the working class, going to take us out of the EU in a hard Brexit, possibly even a no deal. Doesn't quite stack up, does it?
Rather than going full steam ahead for a very strong, clean-cut, hard, however you want to call it, Brexit, that actually Johnson's going to, you know, soften up like butter on a hot day when it comes to Brexit. All of that is slightly worrying. I think that it would be wrong for any Leave voter to become complacent at this point, even though, it has to be said, he's announced this plans for this Brexit bill, which would mean enshrining into law the possibility, both the date for leaving and the possibility of keeping that no deal on the table as something to threaten with. Despite all of that, it's not a given. His heart hasn't been in it from the start, and we only need to remember, you know, a few months ago that the "die in a ditch" slogan was ridiculed and didn't come to fruition. However, I think that one thing is for sure is that the Tories have definitely changed in this election. You could argue sort of beyond recognition. I mean, not just with sort of things that they've done in the last few years, like going hell for leather on the Gender Recognition Act, trying in different desperate ways to signal that they're no longer the nasty party, this focus on the NHS in this election. So there are some people within the Labour side who claimed that they have won the argument, but also brought the Tories more towards the left in some respects. I think that analysis held slightly more weight than this idea that we are suddenly in the dark ages of a incredibly right-wing totalitarian party.
Oh, it's hilarious as well. Also, you see a lot of the kind of new intake. You know, there was a write-up about them in the Sunday Times, particularly a lot of the younger MPs. You know, a lot of them are very young, very socially liberal, you know, and it's just really interesting how, because of all of the sort of narratives that were flowing around the general election and British politics in general before that, you know, all the stop the coup nonsense and this kind of idea that we were in the midst of this kind of sliding slope into the dark old days of the 1930s. It's just how all of that just has evaporated, because this is, as we were saying, it is a change party. It's kind of one which is, you know, the Tory party's been relatively socially liberal for a fair amount of time. There's been obviously a big faction of that, but the fact it has moved left on economics. But what I think is interesting, and what I think is cause for some optimism on the Brexit front or just in general going forward, is the fact that it's very clear that the Tory party recognise how much of a kind of chance people took on them, you know, and I do think that's going to have more of an impact on them going forward, because they know the fact that a lot of the people who've put them there and the people who've given them this new base and this new dynamism, you know, they didn't give them their support unconditionally. They did it under circumstances in which they were faced with a leader on the Labour side that they really didn't like, and it feels like that's going to have some impact on them. It can't not, because if it does, then they're really, you know, going to squander this kind of opportunity that's presented themselves. So on the one hand, we should remain vigilant. We should keep a very close eye on what is going forward in relation to the trade negotiations and how that pans out. Is there going to be an extension? Is this, you know, threat of no deal genuine, all the rest of it? There is some, you know, definitely some cause for some cautious optimism in relation to how things are going to pan out going forward, I think.
And I would say one of the most positives about the election is that those voters who for so long were stuck in these Labour safe seats, who could be ignored and traduced for decades, now matter. They now have a voice, and now they matter to the Conservative Party, which is the party that has also hated them for a very long
weird
time.
But very positive.
And to be fair to Boris Johnson, there's someone in his team who is whispering the right things in his ear, because his speech after the election results in the morning, it was very humble. He said, "I'm humbled." And he said, "Look, I recognise that lots of you will not have been voting for us for the normal reasons, but will be lending your vote because of this issue of Brexit." So I think he's fully aware of how temporary this moment could be. Obviously, they want to hang on to these voters forevermore. But the other thing to be cautiously optimistic about is that I think it is now realised that actually these working class voters in the north have been the kingmakers. And not only have they just kind of delivered a result that's positive for the Conservatives, but they hold the power now, and that actually, you know, it isn't, I don't think the Tories are going to be, or they shouldn't be complacent going forward, because it's still all to play for. And this could change in a number of years. And it's definitely not, you know, they know they haven't won this off the strength of their argument about the NHS or anything else. It's all to do with this one issue, which matters most with those working class voters who now hold the power.
You've been listening to the Spike podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, why not give us a rating, a review, or even a donation? We'll be back next week, but for more great Spiked content, just go to spiked-online.com.